Hello and welcome to the Arsenal Women Arsecast episode 92 with me, your host Tim Stillman, and our co-host Jamie Spanger, looking back at Sunday's fairly drab 0-0 draw with Everton at Emirates Stadium. Jamie, last week, I think sometimes a game or a performance is kind of summed up more by a noise or a gesture, and last week was a kind of phew. And this week feels a bit more like of a puff out of the cheeks and a prolonged look into the middle distance. Before we kind of crack into the minutiae of the game, and obviously we do questions in the second half, what's your overall feeling now having slept on it?
Well, first of all, Tim, it is good to see you. However, I'm not exactly looking too forward to delving into this game, but I think after the game, like you said, it was a bit of a sigh and a oh gosh, staring into the abyss. But I think after a good night's sleep, there's a lot to unpack in this one.
Yeah, I watched it back last night to do the analysis piece, and it didn't get a lot better. There were some performances I kind of reappraised a little bit based on the second half, but it didn't look much better. And Jonas Eidevall, as you'd expect, really. I mean, there's no way he could have come out and said that wasn't really, really poor, but obviously talked about, I think, things everyone could see, that the ball didn't move quickly enough, that there wasn't enough intent, that maybe that did come later in the game, but by then it was the team had left it too late. But we'll come to the more kind of thematic things, because again, not a lot happens in this game, really. The data's not quite out yet on FBref, so I don't know what the XG was, but I don't think it would have been particularly high. The starting lineup, let's start there. Daphne van Domselaar keeps her place in goal after a very good performance away at Leicester. Obviously, the team lineups in the context of the fact that Arsenal play Bayern away on Wednesday, Chelsea at home on Saturday. It's a pretty tough week. Then they've got Vålerenga, and then they're away at West Ham. It's like the games are really coming in thick and fast in this block. Cooney Cross coming in for Leah Volti, Mariana coming in for Caitlin Ford, which I think was about expected. What did you make of the lineup? Did you expect more changes than that? And I guess Van Domselaar, I mean, she played so well, I don't think it can be a surprise, but we know that she kept her place. But we know Jonas likes to rotate the goalkeeper. So what did you make of the starting lineup?
Yeah, honestly, I think there was a lot of changes there that I did expect. However, I expected there to be a little bit more. I think I saw the starting lineup, and maybe a player like Alessia Russo has started quite consistently, so I didn't expect her to be in the lineup with Bayern midweek. I also expected Daphne to hold her place, I think. I think we all expect Manu to maybe come in on Wednesday and start against Bayern Munich, so that wasn't a surprise to me. I was a little bit shocked to see that Rosa Kafaji hadn't started. I did think this would maybe be the game where she would get a start, and we'll go on to speak a little bit more about how she didn't get any minutes at all. But I was a little bit shocked with the lack of rotation. However, in a stock image, I wasn't too surprised.
Yeah, and we had Leah Williamson and Steph Catley back in the team on the bench, which I don't think was a surprise as well. And we'll come on to the subs later, because Jonas said it was pre-planned that they would come on so that they could get some minutes ahead of some other games this week. But Everton, no real surprise from them. We know what Everton are kind of about. They're not really a low blocky team. They're more of a mid-block team, but they play a back five. And the reason they play a back five is not really so much for defensive reasons. It's because they like to take risks in possession. They like to pass the ball around the back. They like to invite the opponent on before going in behind them. And they started with that kind of back three. And when I watched the game back, actually Arsenal start okay, I think, in the first few minutes. And Frida Mornham getting in on that left channel quite a lot. I think there was a lot less happening on the right-hand side in that channel. We had Emily Fox hit the crossbar with a cross. Cooney Cross kind of having a 1-2 with Russo and into the side netting. Mariana having a shot from range after Everton playing out from the back. Frida Mornham had a shot from range, but a lot of it, shot from range across hits the crossbar. Even though in the first 10 to 15 minutes, Arsenal were kind of okay, I think. A lot of shot from range going on there. Is that kind of the impression you got too?
That's exactly what I got. I think I agree with you, Tim. The first 10 minutes, there was a lot of combination play, and I thought Arsenal were breaking down the Everton last line quite well. And then that all really went out the window, and it was this kind of play we saw a lot against West Ham at Chigwell Construction Stadium in January, where it was these long shots from range. And I think any goalkeeper will tell you, we can praise Courtney Brosnan because she pulled off some extravagant saves yesterday, but any goalkeeper will tell you, as soon as you're getting the ball pumped straight at you and you have to make no effort to catch it, it's confidence immediately. And I think that set up Courtney Brosnan to have a good game because she wasn't really being tested. It was probably times where Arsenal could have worked the ball a bit, and then it came to a point later in the game where they're working the ball a bit around too much. So I think Courtney Brosnan had a great game, but those shots from range straight to her just instilled a confidence in her from the get-go. So of course she's going to go on to have a good game, but it started well and then it grew a little bit more tiresome in my opinion.
Yeah, definitely. I can't remember a save from Courtney Brosnan that made me think, how did that not go in? But really at any point during the game, to be honest, not a lot. And, she saved 5 penalties, didn't she, midweek? And we certainly didn't work her that hard. But, and then in the first half, really one chance Everton create, and that's actually a long shot. I think it was from Sari, which Van Domselaar puts onto the bar. Emily Fox has a header over from a Katie McCabe cross. But I think the other thing that kind of got me in this game a bit, Jamie, is that Everton put so many players in the centre of the pitch. They have their 3 centre-backs. They have their kind of box midfield, and they really try and get you in there. But the space is wide. And I thought on the left side, Frida did a really good job of kind of joining up with Mariona and Katie McCabe. But on the right side, where I think really it was Russo supposed to be kind of linking up with Mead and Emily Fox, that side really felt off to me. And I felt like there was something Jonas said to me after the Häcken second leg where I talked to him about Beth Mead taking up quite central positions. And he said, in the first leg, we got that all wrong. Mariona and Mead didn't have the understanding about when one player goes wide and when one player comes in. He said we had it in the second leg against Häcken. We did. This felt a lot like the Häcken first leg to me, where they were both inside a lot. And that really played into Everton's hands, I think.
Yeah, 100%. I think the biggest thing was, in my eyes, Everton really, like you said, Tim, they play this like central back 3 amongst the back 5. So when you try force it through that central channel, you're playing the game into their hands. And although they played really well in the centre, their game was won in the width, because it's almost as if, I don't even know if it was a subconscious Arsenal coming in so centrally, because I don't even think they were getting forced to come in centrally. I think Mariona and Beth Mead were making that decision to come in, and that's how Everton were able to keep their shape, and we played into their strengths, because that back 3 was formidable. We couldn't play through it with our feet, and no one really took the opportunity to dribble through it either. So it felt as if the game was won for Everton in the width, because Arsenal failed to capitalise on how weak they are in those areas compared to centrally. And I think the wingers were really uninspirational yesterday, in my opinion, by foot, by pass. It was like they were cutting in a lot, and I think Mariona is so good with the ball at her feet, and she didn't really trust herself yesterday, which was interesting to see because she's quite a confident player. But I think it was a lot of chances where Mead, Mariona, even when there was a little bit of rotation, when Russo had the ball at her feet, when Frida had the ball at her feet, no one was taking that wide area. They were forcing it into the middle, and that really, really meant that Everton were well set up to combat that.
Yeah, definitely. And Jonas said afterwards in no uncertain terms that he felt the ball just moved too slowly. And when I kind of looked back at it and looked at the analysis piece, there was quite a lot of uncharacteristic stuff as well. Like Kim, in the first half, I thought Kim Little's passing was way off. And she's one of the performances I reappraised on second viewing in terms of she improved in the second half. The first half from Kim is one of the worst halves I've ever seen her play for Arsenal. And I say that because I respect her talent. And I think I would not be respecting her talent if I said anything else, because she was way off beam with a lot of the quite simple passes. I think the same is true of Beth Mead. I think that's one of the poorest games I've seen her have. I don't think Mariona was very good. I picked out so many times where Mariona misplaced simple passes, which is really weird because that is not what you expect from that player. Russo as well was a bit of a ghost in this game, really. I think Frida was the one in the front 5 who I who I thought was kind of bringing her A game. Emily Fox, I thought, was actually good in the first half. I think clearly she's very tired because in the second half, and I think that's why she kind of had to come off. And I think ideally Arsenal might not be playing her at the moment, but for the injury to Laura Wienreuter. But I mean, I guess to preempt some of the questions we've had for the second half a little bit, like there were big execution failures, but at the same time, when those happen all the time, you can't divorce those from the coach. When, like, where do you pitch that in terms of, Jonas said the ball's not moving quickly enough. There wasn't enough intent to play. You've got players who usually are immaculate technically, really misplacing quite simple passes. Like, where do you draw the fault lines between, when it comes to execution, between the players and the coach in this game?
Yeah, look, I think I've never been someone that watches football and is like a bad performance is always down to the manager. I think there's always a big burden of liability on the players. However, I think coming out of that Leicester game, watching that Leicester game, it was 3 points. It was a really, really straggly, tiresome performance. However, it was 3 points. It was a couple days after playing Häcken. However, the performance in my eyes was quite similar this week. And that's when there's a trend coming off a full week break. And I think we've seen Arsenal under Jonas Eidevall struggle a lot in these kind of games very consistently, and it feels like over the last couple of seasons there's been a barrage of excuses that are reasonable. There's obviously been a lot of ACL injuries, long-term injuries coming back. There's been a high amount of squad turnover, but this season it feels like it is the season where he's probably got all the cards in his hand, and especially right now, I think the tired excuse isn't one that I'm willing to make because this team is about to go into a period where they will soon have the FA Cup as well. They will soon have the League Cup as well. That's 4 competitions. If you're tired already, there is a little bit of an issue there because I think that he's almost got it all that he needs right now. And I think the lineup in my eyes, I understand because Bayern's midweek. However, the substitutes in my eyes were completely misexecuted. I think that a lot of playing comes down to if the players don't look inspired, there's usually an issue with not just the manager, the coaching staff, but the manager himself. There's usually an issue there because players play for their manager just as much as they do the badge on their shirt. So I think it's yes, the players looked uninspiring, they look tired, but there is a lot of fault that I think needs to be analysed on how this consistently happens against these kind of teams. It happened against Everton and Walton Hall Park. It happened against West Ham, Spurs and Liverpool. Liverpool, maybe you set them apart a little bit more because they had a great season last year, but I think there's a lot to be analysed now because it's repetition, I think, is the issue.
Yeah, definitely. Like, whatever about low blocks, mid blocks, things like that. Like the bottom line is this Arsenal team don't score enough goals. That's where they lost the title last season. They finished 5 points behind City and Chelsea. Go and look at the goals scored column. That's where those 5 points went. I think they were like 18 goals behind Chelsea. And Chelsea were without Sam Kerr for half a season. So the simple fact is they don't score enough. And that's why, I mean, I guess if you want to be positive and look at progress, at least Arsenal didn't lose this game 1-0, which, because this reminded me a lot of the Tottenham game last season, which, perhaps that is progress, that it's 0-0 instead of losing 1-0 now. But it ultimately, what happened in a lot of those games is Arsenal went 1-0 down, or they went a goal down. They didn't have enough goals to get it back. Like against Liverpool and Spurs, going 1-0 down is not ideal, but you should be able to get it back, and Arsenal couldn't. And so this is consistent. And I go back to, we had Mia Eriksson on this podcast, Swedish, well, was a journalist, works in Swedish football. And I asked her a bit about Jonas Eidevall and his style, and I asked about some of the flaws, and she said, she highlighted a year that Rosengård didn't win the league because they drew 0-0 with the team at the bottom of the table, and she kind of alluded to, maybe a bit of an issue around playing teams like that. And, I think there's probably a mental component to it now as well when this starts happening quite a lot, that the players probably think, oh, God, here we go again. So it's for me, a lot of players had poor games, but at the same time, I think once you're in the 4th season of a coach, like that doesn't mean that those players don't have agency and they don't share some fault at this stage. But at the same time, like I just don't really think that should be happening to so many players at the same time. We come on to the second half. Like Jonas said after the game, he felt the second half was an improvement. I felt that was slightly generous in that I think the first 18 minutes of the second half aren't much different. To be honest, I think it's the triple substitution that starts to change things a bit on about 63 minutes. So, Stina comes on for Russo. Oh, 1 second. This will be doorbell music for Andrew. 1 sec. Door's just gone. Sorry about that. My wife orders so much stuff, it's like working in the Amazon warehouse sometimes. Anyway, so Stina comes on for Russo. Leah Williamson comes on for Lotte Wubben-Moy, and I did see Jonas a fair few times talking to both centre-backs about, really like getting some cross-field passing going, and obviously Leah's a good option for that. But I do think the one that changed things was Caitlin Ford for Emily Fox. And you and I spoke to Caitlin on Friday, and she corrected me on her fullback era, which I thought was at Portland Thorns, and she was like, no, it's younger than that. But she came on at right back. I mean, I felt that was the most impactful sub of the lot. What did you, and I did feel like that triple sub did make a bit of a difference. What did you think of the opening of the second half and then like the triple substitution at that point, and maybe some of the choices that were made?
Yeah, a lot to unpack in that one. I think that the opening stages of the second half, to be honest, I have a mixed emotion of how I felt at halftime, because a little bit of me thought, okay, get together at halftime, rethink this, unpack this, they'll come out firing. But another half of me thought, this doesn't seem like the day. It does seem like it's going to be a very repetitive day of just trying to break down a wall that's never gonna crash. So I thought that the opening stages of the second half were quite tiresome and repetitive. I don't think there was really any big chances that really transpired. Those triple subs, I think, made a difference. I don't know if I can say that Stina made a huge impact when she came on, to be honest. I think she was a little bit lost in her role as well, but I think Caitlin Ford was probably the best substitution of the day. She came on at right back, and I think that there's a lot to say about the substitutes, and Tim, I'm sure we'll get to this and the options that he's provided and the reasoning he's provided. But with Caitlin Ford, I thought she brought some energy and she brought some life. And not only that, I think she knew that, look, defensively it's okay. Everton did go forward, but very, very rarely and circumstantially. So I thought she knew that she didn't really have to stay tight with the defense, and she pushed up straight away. She also came in to right back, carried the ball up, then was on the left wing at some stage, and she was really the only energetic player, I thought, of the day in terms of the wide areas. So I think Caitlin Ford was probably the substitute that worked the hardest, and she probably created the most opportunities as well. But it's hard for Caitlin Ford because I thought Beth Mead looked tired, so she was kind of doing the running of the line. She wasn't really getting an overlap. She wasn't really getting a 1-2. There wasn't really energy with the 10s, so I thought she worked well with what she could have had, but in terms of substitute, she was definitely the strongest. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about the other decisions, Tim, but yeah, I think Caitlin Ford was probably the most inspirational of the substitutes.
Yeah, definitely. We will come on to the others, not least because I asked Jonas a question about it. But I think one of the reasons Caitlin made such a difference, I think, first of all, you're right, she wasn't really playing right back at that stage, was she? Arsenal didn't need a right back at that stage, and they did, the relatively sensible thing and just threw her on the wing. But I think she just gave Arsenal width, and I think they really missed that because Mead and Mariana were both inside at the same time quite a lot. And I mean, first of all, she was just an extra player in the attacking line because they basically went from having a front five to a front six, and Caitlin was the one who had the space. But also, like I said earlier, that's kind of where you get Everton. That's where the space is out wide. And Caitlin actually, if you look back, has a really good scoring record against Everton. And I think that's one of the big reasons, because she's, of all of Arsenal's wingers, there's not that many of them, but she's the one that holds width. And that's why she's incredibly useful. And that's why I think I did understand the criticism of her last season. I'm not going to sit here and tell you I think she was absolutely brilliant, but I do think she was very harshly observed, because I think sometimes people underestimate the selflessness, but the need for that role for someone to just kind of stay wide and stretch the pitch a bit. So I thought she made a difference because of that. I thought as well, Emily Fox looked tired in the second half. I thought she was very good in the first half. Like, I think Liberty Simons asked the question about Emily Fox's chances. Emily Fox averages more than a shot a game, which is wild for a fullback. And this goes back to her signing. Because she comes into central positions quite a lot, she gets a lot of shots off. And the Emily Fox for Arsenal goal is coming. And she has like a good shot. I mean, the cross that hits the bar, that's a cross that hits the bar, but she has a header that goes over. But I just think she was exhausted in the second half, and like rightly so, because she had no summer. And I do think very much the plan was for her to not play the last two games, essentially. But actually, I don't know, Caitlin at right back, maybe we've found something a little bit there if we wanted to look for a very rare positive light in terms of something we can do when we're chasing a goal. But then, and Caitlin then hits the bar from across as well, because she's that spare player on the back post. But then there's a couple more substitutions. There's Steph Catley for Katie McCabe. Again, I think Katie McCabe is quite tired. And Jonas Eidevall said after the game that, they've had injuries in defence and it was unsustainable to keep playing those fullbacks. But then he also brings on Leah Volti for Kyra Cooney-Cross. And this means he doesn't bring Rosa Kafaji on. What did you make? I mean, you've already said you didn't think the subs were great. So, what I guess what would you like to have seen done differently with those subs in particular?
Yeah, look, I think what Jonas said, Tim, you asked about the substitutes after the game, and what Jonas's response was to those who haven't already seen it was he wanted to give minutes to Steph Catley and Leah Williamson coming into a heavy block. In my opinion, I just don't know if that makes a lot of sense. I think if he were to say, we wanted to give Emily Fox and Katie McCabe a breather, that makes sense in my head. Gotcha. I don't really know if Leah Williamson is a player. I think she was always going to come on. I always thought she was going to come on today because I expect her to play against Bayern in the midweek. But I just don't know if I need to give defenders minutes when I'm 0-0 down. 0-0, not down. It did feel like they were down, though. When it was 0-0, I don't know if that was at all a clever thing to do. I was speaking to someone else that was in the press box, Jay Carter, yesterday, and Jay was saying Victoria Pelova is the player we need in this game, because Victoria Pelova, in moments where there is not a lot going on, it's hard to break a last line, has the ball at her feet and takes on players and then frees up the wingers or frees up the nine. And to me, the only player that could have emulated that yesterday was Rosa Kafaji. I think she's the most creative player with the ball at her feet. And in my eyes, I thought for sure she's coming on in the 60th minute to bring some life to this. Because you mentioned earlier you thought Frida Martin was really good. In my opinion, this isn't the Aussie bias, I promise. I thought Kyra was probably the strongest midfielder yesterday. I think she's probably the best in terms of accurate passes and actually making stuff happen. She'll switch and play a little bit more as well. So the decision to bring Kyra off and not Kim Little off was a little bit baffling to me as well, because if you're gonna bring on Leah Volti, you're keeping Kim on. You're keeping the double pivot. And to me, I don't think Everton posed enough of a threat for that to be necessary. And I'm not arguing that Leah Volti shouldn't have come on, but I think bringing Kyra off instead of Kim Little was a little bit baffling in my opinion. Emily Fox and Katie McCabe coming off, I completely understand that because they looked exhausted. They've played so much football, especially Emily Fox recently. But in my eyes, I think Stina Blackstenius came on and made little to no impact. And Rosa Kafaji was that player that could break down, because we're trying to pass through this Everton last line. It wasn't working. Sometimes you need a player to drag the defenders towards you. She's got the ball at her feet. That will open up Mariona on the left wing. That'll open Stina up because she likes to run in behind. So in my opinions, I just don't think the substitutes and I don't think the reasoning really made sense for me yesterday.
Yeah, I agree. I think the fullbacks coming off, I'm fine with, because I do think that they're both probably in the red zone, and I think rightly people would be very annoyed if one of those pulled a hamstring about now. And obviously it's not an exact science, but yeah, I think Emily Fox is only playing really because Laura Wienreuter's injured, and they'd like to have given her 2 games off and then put her back in for Bayern and Chelsea. But I'm with you on that last one, Volti for Cooney Cross. I have the same issues with it as you. Watching the game back, I agree with you. I think Kyra was very good, actually. I wasn't as impressed with her at Leicester, but I was in this game, maybe because there was less defensive responsibility. Like I say, I think Kim improved in the second half, but I would have taken her off before Kyra anyway. And I don't see Leah Volti as a defensive change so much, just because I think she's one of Arsenal's best passers into the final third, and she's actually a very good crosser of the ball as well. But I just think in that moment, with the game state as it is, I'd still rather put Rosa Kafaji on. Just for that. Look, Rosa's going to be a frustrating player, right? I'd bet money if she came on, there'd have been a couple of shots over the bar. There'd have been like a couple of through balls that didn't come off. But I kind of think Arsenal needed that jeopardy at that stage, and I think it's quite likely, maybe one of those shots goes in, maybe one of those through balls goes in, because we did need to change it up. And I understand that Rosa Kafaji is at the beginning of her time at Arsenal, but at the same time, this is surely what she was bought for. And yeah, I thought Mariana was quite poor. Beth was quite poor. I understand more keeping Beth on because she does score goals, even when she's not performing brilliantly. But yeah, I felt not bringing Kafaji on was a mistake. And I do think, like, personally, I'd have been happy to maybe move Frida back into one of the 8 positions, have Kafaji, like, just really go for it. Like, that's why the Caitlin Ford sub made an impact, because it moved us from a front 5 to a front 6. And I almost think if you then go, like, put Kafaji on, take Kim off, have Frida as one of your 8s, then you're going to like a front 7. And then you can really, really kick through the gears. And I think that was a mistake not to do that. But it finishes 0-0. I mean, I tweeted after the game, I don't think Arsenal can have any complaints over that result. I felt Everton looked relatively comfortable. Goalkeeper made all the saves I'd expect. And I just want to read, because we'll talk a little bit about the post-match press conference, I guess, before we go into part 2. And this was Jonas's answer to my question, which was basically why he felt the performance was as it was. And he said, the first half we play with too little intent. We move the ball too slow. We have quite a bit of control, but here at home we should have much higher standards on ourselves and our attacking game. When we don't move the ball quicker than that, it's really hard to break down a side like Everton. I think the intent in creating the momentum, we do it in the second half, but we leave it too late to be happy about that. That should have been the case from minute 1. And you and I spoke to Brian Sorensen as well, and Everton are very similar to Häcken. I asked him about the prep, and he said, it's fair to say I showed the players a lot more clips of the Häcken first leg than I did Arsenal's games against Leicester and Manchester City. I mean, I guess your takeaways from what both managers said after the game.
Yeah, I think speaking to Brian Sorensen was quite interesting. I'm honestly someone that really respects him as manager. I think he's dealt a harsh hand in 2 seasons in a row. I think he plays good football, and he doesn't... Yeah, I think he plays inspirational football for what he's got in terms of club backing and players out injured almost consistently. So it was interesting to talk to Brian, and mine was more just about asking him about the mentality, because I think we saw a similar thing, and this leads into one of the questions I have for later. We saw a similar thing with Arsenal a couple of seasons ago when they were the most thin on the ground is when they were probably playing the best football, because it feels like a stronger mentality when teams are in harder positions. And that's what Brian really said is what the team were able to do off the back of this harsh news about Aurora Ghali, of course, and Inma Gabara. So I think Brian as well mentioned that Everton didn't sit in a low block. They had offensive moments, and he actually said he would have liked them to keep the ball more and capitalize on them. And it felt as if maybe the players were a little bit more nervous and a little bit more reserved and sitting back. And he said, I think we could have played the ball around Arsenal as well, because they were a bit misshapen in that way. In terms of Jonas, I think, yeah, a lot of it is a lot of the questions that came from a couple other people were, how do you prepare your team for Bayern now? And I think there was just too much to dissect about that Everton game to move on to the Bayern Munich game. But honestly, I think, again, he said what he said about the substitutes. He said what he said about the composure and the intensity. And I think it was exactly that. It was a lack of intensity. It was a lack of desire from Arsenal. And that transpired in so many different ways.
Yeah, I agree. Look, this isn't an Everton podcast, but I agree with you in Brian Sorensen. I think he's a very good coach. I think he gets more than the parts available to him out of that Everton team. And Everton's problem is kind of similar to us on a different scale. They just can't score. If you gave them Beth England, Rachel Daly, even a Nikita Paris, I think in terms of the way they're coached, I think that they're like more of a mid-table level team, but they don't have any goal scorers. And they had injuries for this game. They bring on Izzy Hobbs, who's like 17 years old in defence. So, and they were unlucky to lose 1-0 to United last week. So in terms of goals conceded, Everton are nowhere near a relegation level team, but in goals scored, they are. That's why they're in the bottom half of the table. But they give teams problems, I think, defensively. But from Arsenal's perspective, I think everything Jonas said was logical and correct. But it's his fourth season now, and this isn't the first time we've seen this. Häcken away, Leicester away, even in pre-season, the Southampton game, it does feel like by miles our best WSL performance been at home to Manchester City. And I almost feel, I wouldn't say comfortable, because Bayern and Chelsea are really good teams. And even if we play brilliantly, we might lose. But I worry less about the setup and how we might perform in games like that. It's these games. And unfortunately for us, these are the games that happen more often. So it was a puff out the cheeks kind of day. And I think a lot of Arsenal fans feeling a mixture of despondency, some kind of anger, and lots of questions over the manager's future, which we'll address in part 2 with your questions, because obviously we have loads and loads of questions about that. So we'll be back with your questions right after this. We are back, myself, Tim Stillman, and Jamie Spanger, talking over Sunday's disappointing 0-0 draw with Everton, disappointing performance, disappointing result. Obviously, that informs completely understandably the tenor of the questions. Jamie, I think to start, instead of reading out a question to begin with, every time we do one of these, we always have questions about Jonas's future. And some weeks I think that's a topical discussion, and other weeks I kind of, not so much that I think it's less topical, and I don't think every game needs to be a referendum on the manager, but sometimes it is topical, and this week, frankly, it is topical. So instead of reading out one question, we've had loads about the manager's future. Should he go? Will the club act? When will the club act? Etc. etc. Where do you stand on the subject of the manager's future?
Yeah, look, whether the club will act or not, I think that's a different kettle of fish that we probably can't judge about. However, I think for Jonas, we've said it a couple of times already this pod, it's his fourth season with the club, and there's obviously excuses in the last couple of seasons with long-term injuries and factors that maybe made the conditions a little bit harder than him, but he's almost gotten what he wants over the summer. I think maybe bar the winger, but again, that last deadline day bid for Kira Walsh makes me think that maybe Arsenal weren't too active on that anyway. So I think for Jonas, it's just this repetition that we've been seeing with Arsenal playing against these, I don't want to say bottom teams, but these lower level teams in the WSL, and they're really struggling. And one-offs, that's hard. Sometimes players and teams will play a really ridiculous low block, and it's so hard to break through them. But it feels like it's a consistent thing with Arsenal, and this repetition of struggling against these teams, against these setups, against these plays, it's hard because this for Arsenal feels like the year in the WSL. Chelsea are going through a big transition under Sonia Bonpastor. City have maybe defensive qualms that they need to combat. If they get an injury, I think they're in a bit of trouble because they don't have the depth. So it feels like this is the season to capitalize, and it doesn't feel like anything is changing. And as a fan watching this, not just someone who analyzes it, it's tiring because it is this repetition of the same thing. And maybe that is a managerial change. And I do think, like you, Tim, I'm less worried about the Bayern and the Chelsea game, to be honest. And I think there is a very high chance that Arsenal perform very well against these top sides. But then you've got West Ham, on the 20th of October, and I think that's a telling one. But I'm not going to lie, like that West Ham game probably means more for Jonas and his job than the other two games do, because I think Arsenal automatically play better against these free-flowing teams where they don't really have to combat the setup. So I'm not at all against what fans are kind of calling out for, because I do see the reasoning. And I think for me, it's just repetition of the same thing and we're not really seeing any changes. And I can understand why that's being swallowed hard.
Yeah, definitely. I think this block is pretty important going up to that West Ham game, because there's an international break after that, and that tends to be when the dagger swings for a manager. I mean, like I've said this a few times over the summer, and I don't mean to say it as any kind of because I think it's an amazing kind of statement or anything. And I'm not kind of saying it. I think a lot of people think that, well, let me say it first, like there is pressure on the manager to deliver this season. Like there is, I think it very much is the case. Win the league, win the Champions League, or go very close to one of those things, or you're in danger. So, and I don't I think it would be amazing if that wasn't the case, basically. So I'm not saying that as I think a lot of people think I'm saying that as some kind of defense of the club, or whatever. And it's really not. It's just kind of a statement of fact. And I don't think that anyone at Arsenal should feel amazed that those are the demands. The question then comes, well, what would anything happen during the season? Would it happen this early? What are the benefits of of it happening this early versus the kind of drawbacks? I do think this block is important, the next 4 before that international break. And whether the club acts now. I mean, I guess to draw a comparison, in 2017 under Pedro Loza, Arsenal had a pretty inauspicious start, having had an inauspicious season the season before, and they kind of swung the axe late October. Well, officially it was mutual consent, but I think Pedro might have been mutual consented. Excuse me. And then Arsenal found Joe Montemuro, and actually Joe changed things pretty much instantly, and Arsenal went on a massive run, really good run, and really nearly qualified for the Champions League, having started miles back. So if you get the appointment right, perhaps there is an argument for saying, look, let's not just toss the whole season away. But I personally, I'm probably not quite there yet, but I do think this block before the international break is absolutely crucial. And there is probably an argument that if Arsenal lose to Chelsea next weekend, that almost the title it's too early to say it's out of reach, but you start readjusting to thinking, well, we've got to make sure we qualify for the Champions League. So, look, is the manager under pressure internally? Yes, I think he is. I don't think that's a shock to him or anyone. And he will tell you, he's been asked this question several times already this season, and he will tell you, I know, no one puts more pressure on me than myself. But we'll see on that, I guess, at what point the club would act if they wanted to. I've genuinely got no idea. But perhaps, Jamie, since I did such a big monologue there, I think that this is a really interesting question that goes into much of the same things, and it's from Yana at YanaDW_. We can talk about tactics, but the best period under Jonas was when we had all the injuries, end of 22-23, and there was just some kind of determination and belief within the team. That feeling seems to be gone completely, and isn't that probably the biggest indicator that it's time for a change? What do you reckon on the kind of, I guess, the belief and the motivation of the players?
Yeah, I had this question. This is exactly what I was alluding to before when I said it feels like that best season of intensity and desire from the team, or when they were going through much injury strife and they were so thin on the ground. And there was that whole togetherness aspect. And to me, it feels like this is probably under Jonas Eidevall the worst period of that we've seen in terms of players playing together. And I don't know if you can blame turnover for that, because I think that the introductions over the summer have been few, and we're filling holes that were needed to fill. So I think that's what we saw out of Everton yesterday. It was this kind of headstrong performance in a turmoil, and that's not present with Arsenal right now. And I think maybe you saw glimpses of it at Meadow Park against Häcken in that second leg, where the team said, okay, there's a job, let's band together. However, I think it just feels like the players aren't buying into the philosophy, and that always transpires through intensity. You're even seeing it in the Premier League with Manchester United under Eric Ten Hag right now. That team should be performing better than they are, but it feels as if the players aren't buying into the system. Therefore, they're not bringing the intensity that's necessary to the game. So I completely agree with this sentiment. And I think whether that's just down to the manager, I think that is a coaching staff thing. I think that's a club thing, but the manager has such a big and important and vital role in setting the culture up at the club. And it feels as if the players right now aren't being able to do that. And you shouldn't have to have an injury crisis to be able to have this strong mentality of let's go out and win this game at the Emirates in N5 against Everton. Like, you shouldn't need anything more than just that simple circumstance to spur you on. So I completely agree. It feels like there's a culture issue right now at Arsenal. It feels like the players aren't motivated, and usually that comes from within.
Yeah, I think I think there are two concerns. First of all, I'd always considered Arsenal quite a good pressing team under Jonas, even when they weren't great in other areas, perhaps. But I don't see that at the moment, and I think there's always been a lingering question around sustainability in terms of winning the league. Like, I still think Arsenal could win a cup under Jonas this season, because the cups basically rely on you beating Chelsea and Manchester City in some kind of order. And I think like his style is quite set up for cup football. But then there's that question of sustainability over a season where, like, I think the reason Jonas and Arsenal are quite good in big games is because like every little detail matters. It's quite reactive. Like, one team does something and you have to respond, and they respond and you respond. And I think he's really good, or generally really good in that environment. But when it's this team are sitting in and they're not going to do anything else, and you've got to try and break them down, and there's almost, I'd not say there's nothing you can do as a manager, but I almost feel like the zoom out philosophy, kind of when you play those 14 or so games a season where it's just they're going to sit in, you've got loads of talent, go and let the talent win the game and rack up the points. Like, to me, I think that's where all the questions always been a little bit, but now it just feels a little bit more pronounced than that. Do you have a question for me, Jamie?
Yes, I do. This is a bit of a double barrel one. I know you love the double barrel ones. This is from Lane at Lane's Ford. The lack of width was noticeable when watching the team, and I'm sure you guys will touch on that. In your opinions, what is the solution going forward? Do you trust that the wide players will eventually get it right, or do you switch it up personnel-wise? And then Lane has said, follow-up question, how much of this is impacting the central players like Russo and Stina, or is the responsibility on them to create more for themselves? I think whether it's a quality or quantity issue, it's probably a bit of both, but I'm interested to hear your thoughts on that, Tim.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's too early for me to have this conclusion really firmly, but I'm thinking more and more that Caitlin's the one who has to start because she holds the width. And it almost feels like unless Beth and Mariana can get that understanding going properly on a regular basis about who stays wide and who comes in, I kind of feel like Caitlin is the one that gives you that certainty and that structure, that kind of, staying pretty wide. And I do think she's probably been the best performing of the wingers so far. I've no idea whether that will prove to be the case long term. Maybe Beth and Mariana do get it right. But it does feel to me like Caitlin should be starting because she brings that kind of structure. I also think in terms of personnel, I mean, you have to revisit the decision to try and spend all the family silver on Kira Walsh when I think Arsenal really needed another wide player. And that's another way they could have got Kafaji into this game. They have brought her on out wide the last couple of games, and I really think they should have gone for a wide player. And I'd be very surprised if that wasn't revisited in January. So as to the impact that's having on the central players, I think a little bit, yeah, because I think what we're asking the strikers to do, we're kind of asking the striker to bear right a little bit. So Frida goes out to the left to form a bit of a triangle on the left, and we're kind of asking either Russo or Blackstenius to form a bit of a triangle on the right. And sometimes that means they're just not in the penalty area, quite frankly, or like no one's in the penalty area. So I don't know. It feels a little bit intricate. Maybe a little bit too intricate at times, and that's why I think the Caitlin sub made a difference, because it was so simple. It was just, we're putting a sixth player in the attack now, basically, against your back five, and I do wonder whether it's slightly overcomplicated, but I'm not smart enough to say what the answer to that is. I'm much more. I'm better at spotting problems than coming up with solutions. Why don't we pull out another question here? And I think it kind of goes into something very, very similar. There's a couple of questions that kind of get at the same thing. One from Beth McCowan at Beth R. McCowan. Seeing lots of criticism for Russo and Mead in particular. Is the focus on individuals justified? Does the accountability need to be more widespread? And John Booth at John Booth _74. How concerned that should we be after a full week of training on the back of a poor game last week? The players couldn't play the way that Jonas had wanted them to play. So I guess let's keep the focus on Alessia Russo and Beth Mead, because I think, we'd both say they didn't perform anywhere near their kind of capabilities. And yeah, I guess coming back to that question of where, was that an individual thing? Is that a coach thing? Is that a team thing?
Yeah, gosh, I think there's so much to say in terms of that. I think it's a good question because for me, Beth Mead and Alessia Russo both underperformed yesterday, but in different ways. I think that Beth Mead was wasteful on the ball, and I don't think she was really capitalizing on the opportunities that she had. There was one touch when she floated in, she had the ball, and she's kind of turned blindly and chipped it into an Everton defender. And it's like, just have a look. You have the talent to be composed. Whereas I feel like Alessia Russo was almost absent, and I don't think they had the same performance, although they were both quite poor, I think. And I think Alessia Russo started well. She had the ball a little bit to her feet, but she just seemed so unsure about what her role is. And I don't know. I think there's issues because I've said this probably every single week. There's issues against Manchester City. Alessia Russo has missed some sitters, and that is a striking issue. That's a player that should be putting away chances. However, in the Leicester game, it feels like she was left on an island, and that's a system issue in my opinion. And it felt the same yesterday. I was surprised that Stina didn't play because I don't believe that Everton play a particular low block, and I think Stina would have been the better player to play yesterday. And I think Alessia Russo is unsure about her job description because she's not being given that set role. And like what you said before, Tim, it does feel like the nine is being told to kind of float right, and Frida's coming up and maybe playing almost really high on the left side. And in my opinion, it feels like he's trying to be too intricate about it. If that's a formation you want to go to, do that and tell the nine what they want to do. But it feels as if the players are trying to emulate and guess what he's trying to say without it just being a set. This is our game plan. Try play with that. So I think it's the players aren't being told really what their jobs are, and I don't think either nines are aware of that, and they haven't scored. They've scored, I think, one goal in 14 games or 15 games between them, which just isn't good enough at the high level when you look at teams like Chelsea and teams like Bunny Shaw has assisted yesterday, and Mary Fowler's scored, and these nines are back-to-back scoring. So it's a player issue, but in my opinion, yesterday no one was particularly good. I'd say Emily Fox had a good game. I think Kyra had a good game, and Frida had moments, but I don't think it was just those players, and I have seen a big pigeonhole on both of them in the responsibility. And I think Beth maybe a little bit more because it felt like it was a personal problem. She was there was a lack of composure. But for Alessia, I feel like she was again left on an island, and I don't really know what she's meant to do when she's not getting the service or the game plan to play to her strengths.
Yeah, because Beth's always involved. And at times that was to the detriment yesterday because the execution was bad. But you're right, Russo wasn't really involved. And yeah, I mean, I was really confident about her this season because of what I saw at the end of last season, going into some Lionesses games this summer, pre-season. She really looked like she'd got it locked about, being in the area a bit more, being in those kind of zones. But I kind of think as well, when you taking the strike, I think it's okay to ask the striker to drift wide a little bit and create those triangles, but then you've got to have someone coming in, and that's the thing, we don't really have that. Frida, to be fair, Frida scored a couple of goals this season doing that, but it feels to me like maybe one of the double pivots should be in there as well. Whereas, Kim and Leah, they're asked to stay very much, outside the area to collect clearances and keep teams under pressure. But it doesn't feel like we always have that secondary run. So, I'm a bit I'm worried about the Russo thing now, because I think to be a killer striker, you can't have like that real crisis of confidence, and it does look like she's going through that a little bit. Your turn to do a question for me. Sorry, I keep answering your questions as well.
Oh, I love it. I love the chat. I've got one from Fargo Boyle at Jobs OB. Is there a lack of a game B option from Jonas Eidevall in these games? Where are the goals from the midfield going to come from? How did the game end up with Russo, Caldente, Frida Marnham, Beth Mead, and Stina Bucks-Dennis all playing centrally into Everton's defensive strength? So really, I wonder what you think, Tim. Does it feel like when Jonas kind of sets up his weekly game plan against an opposition, does it feel like he can't really change from that? Because in the Man City game, I think we saw him adapt a little bit too much, maybe to his own detriment. He was a bit too proactive. But do you think there's a little bit of reactiveness in his managerial style?
Yeah, so I think Arsenal have a plan A and a plan B, largely around who the striker is between Russo and Stina. I think what we're talking about here is there a plan C. And the answer to that at the moment is no. Or if there is, it's not that effective. And we already talked about like Rosa Kafaji as a bit of a plan C that wasn't utilised. I mean, I think what this comes back to really is in these games, Jonas is a real structure coach, and the structure generally is particularly behind the ball. The structure is usually pretty good under Jonas, and I think it even was yesterday. But Sunday, depending when you're listening to this, it's not really a structure behind the ball kind of game. So I think really the question there is kind of a little bit what we talked about in the first half. Like, do we need Kim Little and Leah Volti in a double pivot when games are like this? When we saw how impactful Caitlin Ford was basically as a sixth forward, just throwing an extra kind of forward in there. Can we do more with one of those eights to like actually get to the edge of the box, to get to the penalty area? Can we play with 1-6? When the game states like this, and yeah, I think that's like for me, Frida. I think Frida can be an 8. I don't think she has to always be a 10, particularly again when the game states like this. So. I think the weird thing is Arsenal are trying different things against these low blocks. That they're not playing in exactly the same way. Like this time last season, the problem was the ball was going too wide too early, and they were just slapping the ball into the penalty area. And this time they're not doing that, but now the wingers are too far inwards. So it feels like none of the modifications work. So I think there probably is a plan C, but it hasn't worked. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think I agree. It feels like a different scenario to last year, just adding on what you said with the wingers. Because last year we saw a lot of just like wasteful crosses going into the area. This year it feels like Arsenal can't actually break down the defence well enough to even make those crosses, or when they are there, they're going to the first man and they're very rushed. So yeah, I agree with you that maybe the plan's there, but the execution is well off, I think.
Question then, we haven't really talked about, I mean, I don't think I or a lot of our listeners have the energy for crowd discourse anymore, quite frankly. And we kind of, but this is like a football question within the crowd question. But this is from Vegetarian Dumpling at Veg Dumpling. Great username that. Excellent crowd yesterday for a game against Everton, 25,000. But do you think board draws like this will give the club any jitters about its decision to move most of its games to the Emirates? Yesterday's offering will hardly do anything to turn casual fans into regulars. Where do you sit on that? I have an opinion on this, but where do you sit on that?
No, I don't agree with that. I think that the clubs. I just think performances like that are not something that the club is planning for, because it's Arsenal and they're two separate conversations. I think you're bringing women's football to the Emirates Stadium for reasons that aren't performance based. Obviously, that comes with the fact that the club want the team to be performing. That is because Arsenal want Arsenal to win. That's a given. But I think boring fixtures like yesterday, because it was a very tiresome game to watch, isn't going to make the board look back and say, damn, shouldn't have given the women's team that opportunity to play at the Emirates. And I think that's a very short-sighted kind of generalization. I can see what they're saying, though. I think it's more, will it mean that less people come through the turnstiles? Like maybe a casual fan that likes watching the Arsenal men has come to the game yesterday and said, wow, this is a really boring fixture. Nothing to do with the fact that it's a women's team, but maybe I won't come next week. I don't think it's going to mean the club are going to say, wow, why did we give our women's team that opportunity? Because I don't know if that is an opinion I necessarily agree with at all. So I think maybe it deters casual fans. However, yeah, no, I'm going to say no to that pretty flatly.
Yeah, I think the clubs I think you're right where I completely agree with you. I think you're right when it's two separate things. I think if the club have an issue with the manager, the management, the direction, they should make that decision based on football, not based on like the size of the crowd. Like they can't allow the cart to drive the horse there. I don't think like make the decisions for footballing reasons and the rest will flow. But a question for me, isn't it, from you?
Yes, I've got one from, I feel like we always answer Grace's questions because they're always so good. Grace at lesbians_Stacy says, this one's going to need some translation for you, Tim, but I think it's a great question. The Everton match also felt very AFL/NRL grand final coded. The team that's been in better form all year being beaten by the one that showed up on the day. Hopefully Jamie can translate. Basically, in Australian, so it's Aussie rules, Australian football. Usually in the last couple of years, it's been a case of the team that has finished so the way it works is we have our season and then we've got finals. So the top 8 on the ladder qualify for finals. The team that's been finishing on top in the best form, make it all the way to the grand final, completely bottle it. And yesterday, I wonder, I'm going to spin this on a way, Tim. Do you feel as if Arsenal kind of showed up and lost that game because it felt like a loss? Do you think they lost that win themselves, or do you think Everton maybe provided a shock factor and performed well, or do you think it was, no, Arsenal really didn't execute when they should have?
Yeah, I think we have something relatively similar in terms of the playoff system in the English Football League, where the team that finishes third, i.e. the highest qualifying team for the playoffs, is rarely the one that ends up getting promoted because they get disappointed about not getting promoted automatically, and the team that sneaks into 6 on like the last day rides the crest of the wave. And yeah, so I think I kind of get that concept. I do think that this is a bit of both, in that, look, we've put rightly, I think, most of our focus on Arsenal and taking this game out of isolation. I think that's absolutely right. I think there comes a time where you kind of do have to zoom out, and this is a zoom out day, and you have to be a bit introspective. But when zoomed back in for a moment, I think Everton are a really good team. I do. I think they're really well coached. I think particularly defensively. Defensively, their numbers are above the teams around them by quite a distance. They had a really poor opening day against Brighton. I don't really know what was behind that, but generally speaking, you know, Everton, I watched them play Chelsea at the end of last season. They were pretty unfortunate in that game as well. There were a couple of maybe slightly questionable penalties against them. But at the same time, I kind of agree with Jonas's assessment in that Arsenal just left it too late to go and play. I think if they'd played like the last 20 minutes, if that had stretched over 90 minutes, I think they'd have won like relatively comfortably. But yeah, in this game in isolation, I do take Everton seriously as a team, and the recent results against Everton have been close. Like, they've given us quite a lot of problems of late, and I do think that you'll see more from that. Like I said earlier, give them a goal scorer, and I think they'd be on like Villa, Tottenham, Liverpool, that area of the table a bit more. But I do feel like this was a game. Essentially, Arsenal threw away the first 60 minutes, and that to me means that Arsenal lost the 2 points, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I will ask you a question. I had a decent one on Threads. Let me just bring up my threads, as it were. I should have had this. I find Threads a bit weird, like copying and pasting and stuff like that. That's from at Prashant_AFC. Is this draw as catastrophic as it seems, or do you think City and Chelsea will also lose points against lesser opponents this season?
Yeah, look, I have a question quite similar to that in an opposite regard where it's asking why Chelsea and City have are able to find ways. And I think that we've seen this historically. Chelsea have some scrappy results, even against Aston Villa in the opening weekend on that Friday night at Kings Meadow. I don't think Chelsea were particularly inspirational at all. I think Aston Villa played very well, but Chelsea managed to get wins in games like that. Even the other night at Selhurst Park, I thought Chelsea were not that impressive. And I thought Crystal Palace played quite good football in the opening half, and they were unlucky. And then they've still ran away with a 7-0 lead. So I don't think Chelsea as a team, it's interesting now because it's hard. We don't know Sonia Bonpastor's Chelsea well enough to analyse that, and I don't have a crystal ball. However, I think that Chelsea do find ways, and the they have the killer strikers to be able to do that. When you look at it, they've got Myra Ramirez, they've got Kat Macario, they've got Guro Ratton, you've got Sam Kerr about to retire, and they've got these kind of killer strikers that Arsenal are really crying out for at the minute. Man City, again, they also find ways to do it. Last week against Brighton, I thought Brighton were very good. They've gone up to Manchester. They've put on a good display. City weren't very positive, and they find ways. And I think these are the games that Arsenal really struggle in. Arsenal took 12 out of 15 points from Chelsea and Man City last season. The issue aren't these big teams. We all know that. I don't really see these teams historically struggling against these teams. They manage to find ways against the lower sides. So if I'm going to base it off history, because again, I don't really know about Chelsea yet under Sonia Bonpastor. We haven't seen enough. We've only seen 2 games. One of them was against Crystal Palace, who've just been promoted. But for Man City, I think they often find ways and they struggle against the harder sides higher in the table. So if I'm basing it off history, I think it is an Arsenal problem when it comes to playing against those teams. And I don't really know if Chelsea or City will fall under that same spell.
Yeah, definitely. I think teams will take points off Chelsea and City this year. I do think I think the beginning of the season shown you the middle of the table looks quite interesting. The issue is Arsenal will lose more
Yeah,
than Chelsea and City playing like that. It's that simple. So, I think Chelsea and City will have a shock result or two, but I mean, playing like this, Arsenal will have more of them. So it's kind of almost immaterial. Should we do one more question each and then skedaddle?
Yes, let's do it. I had a couple good ones, so give me a second because I'm deciding which one. I've got the same one that said to Chelsea and City, how do they manage to win games? Let's say, okay, I'm going to bring you back to a mid and low block, Tim, because I know you love thinking about it. This is at Sharon Upal, I want to say, at Sharon Upal 1. It seems that Everton played a mid, not low block today. Like you said, Tim, the same as maybe the Häcken home leg. Has the issue moved to our ability to maneuver a mid block as well as low blocks? If that's the case, then we might are going to struggle this season. What's your opinion on maybe these teams are, because I don't think Everton played a real low block yesterday. They played a back 5, but again, like you said, Tim, it was more of a solid 3 and those 2 wing backs pushed on. So is it maybe just a wing block? Is it a mid block issue and not just a low block issue now?
Yeah, I'm glad you went for this one. I had this one down as well, and I think this is an important distinct. I find it an important distinction. Ultimately, it all adds up to the same thing, so I'm not sure how important it is, but I think that's right. I think that I think that basically Arsenal have looked better in those games when Häcken and Everton did go into a low block for the last 20 minutes because they had to. And that's when Arsenal create their best chances. And it's the same against Häcken in the first leg away at Häcken. In the kind of 60 to 70 minutes where Häcken were kind of in the mid-block and disrupting Arsenal from progressing the ball to the edge of the area, Arsenal didn't create very much. It was actually in the last kind of 10 minutes when Häcken just put everyone in the penalty area that Arsenal looked more dangerous. And I think there's a lot in that about teams who've been able to stop us from progressing the ball to some of our more threatening players in kind of opportune positions. So again, how many times did Mariana have the ball in the penalty area? How many times did Beth Mead have the ball in the penalty area? How many times did Russo have the ball in the penalty area? I mean, she had 0 shots in the end. And then when you look at where our shots were concentrated, a lot of them were defenders having shots I think that's where most of our shots came from. So that tells you a story. So it's not even the midfielders, it's like the defenders. So I do think there is something in that. And maybe that's an exciting new wrinkle this season, that it won't be low blocks, it'll be mid blocks. And that actually teams have looked better against us, keeping us at bay. And it's in that last 15, 20 minutes when they do go back into a low block that Arsenal tend to generate a little bit more. And even last season, like I said, like some of those low block defeats were, to me, more about those teams going 1-0 up and Arsenal just not being able to score twice, not being able to score once quite often. Like Arsenal didn't draw many games last season. They didn't have many shutouts. There weren't many 0-0s. I'm not even sure if there was a 0-0 in the WSL last season. Like they lost, and then there were a couple that, like, they beat Everton 2-1 at home. Wasn't that impressive? They beat Bristol City 2-1 away against a low block. Wasn't that impressive? Like there were quite that we beat Tottenham 1-0 at home, and that wasn't that impressive. Like there were a lot of those games ended up on the margins. Whereas I do think there is something in the fact that the mid block, the Häcken, Everton, like I said, going back to what I asked Brian Sorensen afterwards, like Häcken and Everton are very similar teams, very similar principles. And Brian Sorensen kind of said to my question, yes, that's right. And that's why we showed the players that game. So I do think that is a distinction. Sophie is absolutely right. We're still going to struggle either way. So it's not, it's a distinction, but it's not a justification. Put it that way. Let's go for the last question then, which is from Emily Pritchett, at Emily Pritchett. And this really, again, an astute observation, and I say that because I agree with it, obviously. But it plays into something we've already discussed. And Emily said, Ford was a really brilliant sub yesterday, which we've covered. I felt we missed her in the first half. She and Mariona have combined very well in the first few games, and I'd like to see them together, as I'm not convinced by Mead and Mariona. Or is there a way we can have all three on the pitch at once? And a couple of people asked about the prospect of Mariona playing more centrally, perhaps. And what do you think about that? I get, because a couple of other people asked. I know Belinda, for example, at Belinda AWFC, asked something about this, about Mariona coming inside, particularly even if she doesn't start there, if she goes there a bit later in the game, so Arsenal can get a bit more threat on the pitch. What do you reckon about Mariona playing more centrally and then having, I guess, Beth, Caitlin, and Mariona on the pitch at the same time?
Yeah, honestly, answering the first half of the question, I think Caitlin Ford has made Mariona her best self. I think we saw her play her best football when Ford was on the right side, because I think Ford manages to stay wide, which doesn't condense the middle, and it means Mariona can work her craft without feeling suffocated like she may have yesterday. I think playing all three of them is definitely an option. We know that Mariona can play as a 10, and that's definitely something that would be interesting to exploit. However, I think also the prospect of playing Beth Mead as the 9, we've spoken about a little bit more. I don't think she's particularly doing the work in the wide areas that means she needs to be pigeonholed as a winger right now. I think her work in the width has probably been quite disappointing lately. Not all bad, because I think she's had good moments, and I don't want to put the blame on Beth Mead. I think yesterday was poor, but I don't think she's been overall that as bad as everyone's saying she is. But I think maybe playing Beth Mead as the 9 is also an option in those games where you just need a goal. That's something, like you said earlier, Tim, it makes sense that Beth Mead stayed on the field yesterday, because she does like to pinch a goal in those late moments. In my head, I don't think Stina was doing anything. You can't really bring on a player and take her off, but maybe playing Ford, Mead, and Caldente, Mead more centrally, is something that could be an option. But I think all three players have the potential to play centrally as well. Caitlin Ford does it. I don't see that being an option right now, because I think she's our strongest player on the width, and it would be silly to waste that. But Beth Mead as well. So the answer is yes, but I also think it shouldn't just be a prospect of Mariona coming in maybe a more 10 role. I think it could also be a prospect of Beth Mead playing in a striker role, because it's just about goal scoring and it's about service. And I think Beth Mead will also go and get the ball in those moments where she's not being fed, where perhaps Russo is a little bit more inclined to hang around and wait for it.
Yeah, I think later in games it has to be an option. Like I said earlier, like Frida can be one of the 8s. I think, and then, maybe you don't need Kim Little and Leah Volti all the time when games get like this. I understand starting like that. a bit more. But yeah, I think, moving Maddie on at infield, bringing Frida back a bit, just so you have an extra attacking player on, essentially. Like, there's nothing like clever or tactico about that. Again, to repeat myself, there was nothing clever or tactico about putting Caitlin Ford on at, right wing back, but it kind of, it's too much to say it worked, but it had an impact, I think more impact than the other subs. So yeah, I think that question about Beth being more central will come up more and more. We did have other questions about it, but we kind of spoke about it last time, and I'm sure it will crop up again, quite frankly. But Jamie, that was, I already watched the game back once, and I wouldn't say that was therapy, maybe primal screen therapy, but this felt a little bit more therapeutic. So I hope it felt that way for you, but thanks so much for joining us.
No, thanks, Tim. Definitely. It always feels a little bit better to speak about it after these games, but on to the next one on Wednesday at Bayern Munich.
Yeah, indeed. And I will be out there for that game, so you'll get all the usual coverage that you always get on Arseblog News. From that, we won't be at the open training session because Arsenal are holding that quite understandably in London instead of Munich, and we'll be in Munich when it's happening. But, everything else you will get. If Jamie's sound changed a little bit during this podcast, that's because she changed location. We had a little bit of an internet outage issue, probably in keeping with this game, to be fair. But we got through it, which is probably more than can be said of Arsenal yesterday. But we will be back with another episode next Monday after two massive games against Bayern Munich and Chelsea, which we will obviously win both, and then we'll lose against West Ham, and we'll have all these conversations all over again. And we look forward to doing that with you. Thanks so much, and we'll speak to you next time.